Political theology has always been inherently comparative, as it traces powers, practices, and imaginaries from theology and the Bible to politics, and then back again. Be this in the various accounts of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, of kingship, its critics and rules, that Oliver O'Donovan has analyzed with such searing insight in his book, Desires of the Nations. Or in John of Patmos's juxtaposition of the slain lamb who reigns with the beasts of Babylon and Rome that Michael's abstract, at least, gestured towards. One could mention the works of Augustine, or Grotius, Schmidt, or Agamben, Tanner, or Metz, of those who have shaped the classical and current debates in political theology in the West as they trace these comparative moves between Christian theology and politics. However, the comparative work done in these models remain, with some exceptions, largely controlled by Latin Christian binaries. The two swords, the two kingdoms, the two cities, the religious, the secular. I want to press us a little further into this comparative mode of political theology and ask if we might do our political theology in the future in a more comparative iteration that takes seriously the changing dynamics of migration, the so-called globalization, and the Anthropocene that we've gestured towards. And to do this is not to give up the rich biblical and intellectual traditions of the West, nor to give up on engaging with thinkers like Augustine or Grotius or Thomas, but to bring these political theologies and political ideas to bear in a more radically pluralistic environs, and to think about how political theology might advance in an explicitly comparative hue that takes seriously what we've mentioned before, the robust and in-depth political theologies that emerge from other traditions, be they Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, or various forms of the political theologies of nationalism. I think we've seen this, at least in brief, in all three papers. In asking, for instance, to what extent can a vision of the common good frame and engage our political judgments? It is no surprise that appeals to the common good don't necessarily give us a clear solution to the questions of the EU or the questions of the migration crisis. But interestingly, Professor O'Donovan's suggestions that the common good might be a frame in which other judgments might be made resonates with certain arguments within the Islamic tradition in the 20th and 21st century. More specifically, the return of both maslahah, public interest or common good, and maqasid, or the higher purposes of the law, as fundamental to rethinking what it means to engage in the Islamic jurisprudential tradition in the 20th and 21st century. And like in Christian theology or in Western thought about the common good, these don't give us clear judgments, but they do provide frameworks in which argumentation might be made. In my own work on the World Community of Reformed Churches Task Force on Migration in Europe, we've found the similar problem, namely that all churches agree on the need for a common good, and all churches in Europe agree on the biblical command to care for the stranger and the neighbor. And yet how we make judgments about the balance between these two realities, between the command to be in solidarity with our neighbor in Hungary or in Greece or in Scotland, on the one hand, and in solidarity with our neighbor who confronts us on the borders of the Greek-Macedonian border or on the island of Lampedusa, how these come into tension. There is no clear solution forward. The church can't simply appeal to its white papers. It must engage in the complex questions of political theology. And as we do this, I think one of the key questions that all three papers put to us is how do we engage in this sort of radical complexity in a way that is still marked by our particularity. We have seen, especially here in Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, India, Syria, the United States, a return of particularities, but particularities that are often marked by populism and forms of particularity that seem to demand the exclusion of the other. And I wonder, drawing these three papers together, if we might think of an extension of particularity in forms of solidarity across borders, rather than falling into the sort of binaries that seem to dominate at least American discourse, between sort of globalism or international appeals detached from the deep particularity and specificity of either religious traditions, local traditions, or national identity on the one hand, or sort of rising populism. What would it mean to have a political theology that is both deeply particular and yet marked by solidarity across borders? I'll end with a brief story of how this is being enacted. In October, I was actually in Lampedusa as part of the World Communion of Reformed Churches and the Catholic Church, memorializing the death of 386 migrants who died in a boat accident as they tried to cross, paid for by smugglers. Catholic, a cardinal in fact, and a Waldensian woman preached together about the need for solidarity across these borders and what it means to find the powers of national borders, of legality, of the common good, of natural climate change, all coalescing on this one small island. And what we saw, however, were acts of radical solidarity of Christians, Muslims, Jews, anarchists coming together on this island in a place to offer hospitality and possibility beyond what we often see in the public discourse. And I think it's this sort of lived political theology of solidarities across borders that are otherwise in tension that is a legacy of Duncan Forrester's work, to attend to not only the theological framings, but also to the lived practices of these. And as we think of political theologies going forward, what does it mean to hold together the deep intellectual riches of the Christian tradition, the varieties of secular and political theory, and to bring this into more active conversation with Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, as well as the social sciences, not for the sake of a grand idea, but for the sake of lived practices that seek justice.